Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is a Ukraine war news update for the 1st of April 2023. This is not an April Fool's, although I have seen a number of April Fool's gags on the socials, such as Russia are fixing up T-34s to a new specification and sending them to the front line, all that kind of stuff. I don't know whether it's appropriate to joke in such warlike scenarios. Hey ho. Anyway, we'll put that little question to one side and go to our usual starting place, which is the Ukrainian release figures for the Russian losses for the day before. This is something that critics say is inaccurate propaganda. I think it's pretty accurate these days, if not in the headline figures exactly, but in the indications and reflections it gives you as to what is going on the front line. We have seen quieter figures over the last sort of 3 or 4 days, and I think that signifies that there is a culmination of the Russian offensive. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. 630 is still above average for the whole war, but less than it has been, for example, a week ago when we were having over 1,000 liquidated Russian personnel. So it is low, but not super low. And there are obviously flashpoints along the front line, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and so on. 1 tank, so that's very low. 4 APCs, low. 8 artillery systems, 1 MLRS, so that's fairly decent, but it has been higher. But they need that figure to be consistent, consistently high, I guess, to degrade the Russian offensive and defensive capabilities. Artillery is super important. It's the main source of deaths for both sides. So that is a number that we've seen relatively high over the last couple of weeks. 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, and if that is something like a Buk or particularly a S-300, maybe even S-400, then that is going to be really painful for the Russians. If it's something like an autocannon that fires into the air, some kind of anti-aircraft Gepard type machine, then that's less problematic. 7 vehicles and fuel tanks, 2 pieces of special equipment. We've seen that consistent over the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 pieces a day. If that is electronic warfare radar systems, then that will degrade the Russian capability to hit targets. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, I'm going to go to the UK intelligence because I think this is grade A trolling from the UK defence intelligence here. I think it's just superb. They've got a habit of doing this every once in a while, or even fairly consistently. You've got to understand that the part of the remit here for the release of these on a daily basis is kind of psyops, is propaganda. They are going to be saying things that will be accurate, but the kind of way they say it, at least they couch everything in terms of probability, so the accuracy is within their gauge of the probability. Again, I'll talk about that in a second, but an element of this is going to be digging at the Russians or publicly saying, hey, the Russians aren't all that, and we're going to say that very openly. So here on January the 11th, 2023, Russian Chief of the General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, took personal command of the special military operation, scare quotes, in Ukraine. I love that. Even that's just a dig. Gerasimov's tenure has been characterized by an effort to launch a general winter offensive with the aim of extending Russian control over the whole of the Donbass region. 80 days on, it is increasingly apparent that this project has failed. I mean, they're not pulling punches here. On several axes across the Donbass front, Russian forces have made only marginal gains at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties, largely squandering its temporary advantage in personnel gained from the autumn's partial mobilization. Again, scare quotes around partial mobilization because there's an understanding that they went pretty hardcore into that after, and still continue to do it afterwards. After 10 years as CGS, there is a realistic possibility that Gerasimov is pushing the limits of how far Russia's political leadership will tolerate failure. Ouch. So this is saying there's a realistic possibility, and we'll talk about the yardstick of that in 2 ticks. But they're basically saying that I think this guy's going to be sacked. Or what they're doing is they're saying to the Russian government, to the Kremlin, yeah, he's really crap. You should sack him. We, the UK intelligence, are saying he's crap. He needs to go. And just setting a cat amongst the pigeons there in terms of ruffling those Kremlin feathers. And that yardstick, probability yardstick, this is what the UK intelligence uses. So remote chance is 0 to 5%, 10 to 20% is highly unlikely, unlikely is 25 to 35%, and then 40 to 50% is a realistic possibility. So a realistic possibility that Gerasimov is pushing the limits of how far Russian political leadership will tolerate failure. In other words, there's a 40 to 50% chance that he's going to be ousted. Is essentially what that's saying in intelligence speak. Right, now let's go back to talk about this in a little bit more detail here. So 80 days on, not done a lot. They've squandered the temporary advantage in the last sort of month or couple of months in terms of only making marginal gains on the Donbass front at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties. So let's have a look at that. We're just going into April, so we can look at the stats for March now. In March, Russia managed to occupy about 70 square kilometers of Ukraine. That's less than 0.01% of Ukraine, and a good 24,000 Russians died to take it. If Russia continues like this, then it's just another 240 million dead Russian soldiers until Putin has conquered all of Ukraine. This is, again, having a real dig at the Russians. If the Russian voice is on the thread, on this thread today, talk about copium and Russia are going to win and all this kind of stuff, all you need to do is point them towards the actual statistics. You've just had a full-on offensive as the second greatest army in the world, and you've taken 70 square kilometers in a month. Let's just have a look at what 70 square kilometers is. That is 70 square kilometers for the second greatest army in the world to take in a month, losing somewhere around 24,000 casualties in doing so. That is deeply, deeply unimpressive. And I'm not just being pro-Ukrainian. Yes, I am. Like, there is some kind of bizarre joy in me saying this because I want the Ukrainians to win, and if Russia are obviously failing, then that gives me at least some pleasure. So I will admit that. But just from a neutral, objective point of view, this is just deeply crap. And there's no other way to say that. Look, the Brazilian government has had a recent remapping of the country to have a more accurate idea of the country's borders and whatnot. They found out that Brazil was actually 72 square kilometers bigger than they believed. So Brazil has gained more ground with a simple remeasurement of its territory than the Russian army did, wasting thousands of lives in Ukraine. Interesting. Yes, isn't that interesting? If you're pro-Russian voice, it's embarrassing. And this is the War Mapper does these monthly now, looking at the amount of territory gained by the Russians and the Ukrainians. So the first 2 months of the war, the Russians gained a whole heap of territory as they absolutely, swarmed in their invasion into Ukraine. And then the Ukrainians took some back as they pulled back from the Kiev area, and then eventually they took some more. They gradually expanded, but only very slightly over the next 4 months. Then we had the Kharkiv counteroffensive and the Kherson counteroffensive, or the withdrawal of the Russians. So we had some gaining of territory for the Ukrainians, and then since then we've had very marginal gains for the Russians. And I'm going to have to expand the screen here because that ain't good. But this here is their counteroffensive, or their offensive, their winter offensive, and it's taken the grand total of, what is that, 0.13% of Ukraine's territory in 4 months, and last month only taking 0.01%. That ain't good. They're on no metric is that good. So the Russians are, I think, failing. Now the big question is, can the Ukrainians do something like this again? If they could achieve something like that, then happy days. But there are some people that think that this counteroffensive will be nothing like the Kharkiv counteroffensive. It won't be a lightning offensive. It will be a methodical and slow grinding offensive, because the Russians they've built loads of defenses where they didn't have those defenses in place before, and they are at least somewhat prepared, as in they have been preparing for this. They know it's coming. They've got a pretty good guess about where it's going to be coming as well. So it won't be like the previous one. Okay, the General Staff talks yesterday, Ukrainian General Staff talks yesterday about Ukraine hitting 2 Russian air defense systems over the past day, and they repelled more than 30 Russian attacks. So 30, like if that's a total along the whole front line, that I think has to be the lowest over, goodness knows, maybe 6 months. I don't know how long that would be over, but that is the lowest I can remember seeing. Although we'll talk about that in a second, that there are extenuating circumstances to explain that. 30 Russian attacks conducted and repelled. And the Ukrainians conducted strikes against 2 Russian air defense systems and a radar station over the past 24 hours. The General Staff reported on March 31st, and that will then feeds back into the figures we saw, special equipment there, and indeed the anti-aircraft warfare system. Now let's have a look. Now, could the anti-aircraft warfare system be this Buck M3? That this footage is going around, doing the rounds at the moment. The thing is, like, I'm so sad now that I recognise footage quite quickly. Not all the time, but I swear I reported that previously, and I'm not. Oh, for goodness sake! I mean, great tune, but no. So I'm fairly sure this didn't happen yesterday. That this is old footage. Let's see if anyone's seen this before. Yes. I'm remembering because I looked at this last night, and the reason I picked this version of the footage out is because someone did indeed geolocate this to the 10th of March. So that footage, if you're on the socials like I am and see this, everyone is posting this saying, "Oh, the Ukrainians took this out." The implication is they took it out yesterday. They didn't. So just again, this is about being accurate with what I say, and even if there are Ukrainian claims that seem really good, I mean, it was taken out, but it just wasn't yesterday. So just, we always need to be beware. Now, I talked to you a couple of days ago about the Ukrainians taking out the Zupark 1M counter battery radar, and that being significant because that was the first time that's ever been taken out, one of those pieces of kit. But also, you take out something like that, and then suddenly you have an inability for the Russians to, detect Ukrainian air activity in a certain area. So it could be. So imagine, that was taken out here, right? And then it may be that suddenly they have no radar capacity to locate Ukrainian aircraft in this area, and then suddenly the aircraft can get in and do some damage. It depends how much overlap there is of radar coverage, but that kind of stuff is really, really important. In fact, yesterday's UK intelligence, I didn't talk about it, but they mentioned it yesterday, saying as of 23rd of March, so that this happened a week or so ago, the Ukrainian Special Operation Forces released footage of a Russian Zupark 1M counter-battery radar being destroyed in the Donetsk area. So this is a counter-battery radar. So what this does is when you fire your artillery, it locates where that came from. So it works out the trajectory, works out where it sees it, and then it can pinpoint exactly where it came from. So this is why it's great to shoot and scoot. You fire and then you get out of there, because counter battery will find out where you are, and then the counter battery artillery will hit your location. So if you are towed artillery, then it's much more difficult to get out of the way, or you might not even be trying to get out of the way. You just hope there's no counter battery radar in the area. Now, efforts by both sides to neutralize their opponents' counter-battery radars have been a constant element of this conflict. These systems are relatively few in number, but are a significant force multiplier. So it means that it multiplies your capability as a force, in a sense, multiplying your capacity, because it kind of multiplies your ability to take out, in this case, artillery over a larger, greater range than otherwise. If it may be that you're hit by artillery and locally you can kind of guess where that is, you send up a drone, you do it, so on and so forth, and you might be able to get some kind of ability to hit that that artillery back again. But with these radar systems, it's as though you're doing that, 20 times. You're sending up 20 drones across the area or whatever. You get my point. It's a force multiplier. They allow commanders to rapidly locate and strike enemy artillery. However, because they have an active electromagnetic signature, they are vulnerable to being detected and destroyed. Things like the HARM missiles that are sent from planes that detect radar installations. Russia has lost at least 6. Oh no, it's not the first of these. They've lost 6 of these, at least 6 Zupak 1M, and likely only has only a very limited number left in Ukraine. Regenerating counter-battery radar fleets is likely a key priority for both sides, but Russia will likely struggle because the systems rely on supplies of high-tech electronics which have been disrupted by sanctions. They just won't be able to make those sorts of pieces of kit. Right. Moving on, according to the Ukrainians' command, the Ukrainian drone attack on rail depot at Zhankoy. Now, I talk to you about this. This happened a week or so ago in Zhankoy, where they hit a train that was supposedly carrying cruise missiles. Now, whether the cruise missiles blew up or not, no one really knows. But there was a significant explosion there. Didn't look like secondary explosions. Someone was saying that even if you had cruise missiles on board, they wouldn't have had a secondary explosion. You might have taken them out, but they wouldn't have blown up because you don't transport them with the warheads attached to the rockets, so on and so forth. So it's unlikely that they would blow up. So in other words, those cruise missiles could well have been destroyed and they wouldn't have blown up, if you see what I mean. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was talking about that would be a real hit, not just for the cruise missiles, but in fact, more importantly, possibly for the logistics, that is a rail hub. So the idea here is that it hit the supply of the Caliber cruise missiles, but it's also destroyed the railway connections that Russia still cannot transfer heavy equipment on. So that is interesting that apparently, or at least according to Peter Clifford here, that is still inoperable, that rail network there. So that's very important. Right. Why might there have been fewer troops lost over the last day compared to what might have happened? And why might there'd be far fewer attacks? Well, it turns out that there's been one of the biggest snowfalls in eastern Ukraine in 10 years. I mean, this is very late in year. The climate is pretty screwed up at the moment. In the last 10 years, one of the biggest snowfalls in the last 10 years, and it's slowed down all the fighting. However, street fighting continues in Bakhmut. But even around Bakhmut, there's, I'll show you later in the frontline update, there are trenches like this. Well, in fact, I'll show you now. This is it. This is a trench around Bakhmut, which is, this guy is hip deep pretty much in snow. Ugh. And the issue for this, of course, is when this thaws, then you are going to have some very wet and muddy conditions. Right, let's move on to military aid. Not a great amount to report today compared to some days. US is expected to announce a new $2.6 billion security assistance package for Ukraine as soon as Monday, Reuters has learned. The package would include air surveillance radar, 80 anti-tank missiles and fuel trucks, as well as half a dozen types of ammunition, including tank munitions. There has been talk as well. I think I've got this later. Yes, so let's bring that in now. The US will not provide Ukraine with ATACMS, long-range missiles, General Milley says. This has been asked for a lot of times, but Mark Milley said just yesterday, I think, from a military standpoint, we have relatively few ATACMS. This is something they had said broadly before. We have to make sure that we maintain our munitions inventories as well. I think there's a little bit of overstating what an ATACMS can do and cannot do. So this is true. A lot of people have been saying over time that actually ATACMS are good, but they're not like the panacea. And in fact, they can get taken down with air defense systems themselves, whereas something like a HIMARS, they struggle to take down, and there's 6 of them hitting, although the range might be less, and each individual missile might be less powerful in the sense they have their own advantages. And he kind of says that. You're looking at a single shot with ATACMS. So think of a musket versus a repeating rifle, whereas a GMLRS fires 6 shots and ATACMS fires 1. Now, the range of the ATACMS is longer, but other systems can get you that range. UAVs, for example, could do it. So he's talking about how loading more significant munitions onto drones could do you the similar sorts of damage. And the Brits have a couple of systems. Now this is interesting because a month ago, maybe more, the British announced that they would be sending longer range missiles. In fact, Rishi Sunak, the PM, said it. And then everyone's going, "Oh, what's that going to be?" And we still don't really know. And it might already be there, but there are certain systems. I know we have a fairly decent range of anti-ship missiles, but these kind of munitions are being co-opted to use in other modes. We've seen anti-ship missiles be adapted so they can be used on Buk anti-aircraft missile systems. So yeah, there are things that can happen here. I think they're anti-ship missiles that are used there. So those are some of the things that we are looking at to give them a little bit more legs. But right now, we are not providing the ATACMS. So they recognize that the longer range missiles are important. There are just other ways around this than just providing ATACMS, and the British may be important in that role. I don't know. Ministry of Defense of Sweden wishes the Russian occupiers all the best, good mood and health, says this tweeter here. But do you know what? That's worth playing a little bit of that song. Europe Final Countdown there. Sidebar, first CD I ever bought. And I have gazillions of CDs just over there. A little bit of a music buff and a bunch of vinyl as well. But yeah, Europe Final Countdown, bought that in Singapore airport. Anyway, random. Here we have Swedish CV90s being transported, it looks like, towards somewhere. This is somewhere in the world going towards Ukraine, one assumes. So that's really good. They are ramping up their preparations for the counteroffensive. Netherlands, not all military aid or humanitarian aid is in the form of, you know, inanimate objects and machines. Netherlands has announced that they will be providing Ukraine with up to 11 dogs. Interesting. Can't provide troops, but can provide dogs. Oh, can Russia make some kind of distinction there? There is a philosophical argument about we might have to start talking about personhood and so on. But yeah, so they're providing dogs, brackets not humans. 11 dogs that will be used for mine clearing operations, and these dogs will finish their training in the Netherlands, after which they will revive additional training in Ukraine. A huge boost for Ukraine in the last hour, this was yesterday, as the IMF has approved a whopping $15.6 billion handout. It's designed for 4 years, with the cash being used to support reforms and integration of Ukraine into the EU, as well as easing urgent needs of the people during war. And I'm going to share with you in one of my extras over the weekend, talk about Ukrainian corruption and what they are doing about that. Okay, Ukraine confirms JDAM precision bombs are now being used in combat. So this is definitely happening, and always worth looking at these Drive articles. The Drive, the War Zone, they have some really good articles. I've shown you footage of potential JDAM usage. Often it's not. It's like mine clearing vehicle being used or being blown up, one or the other, or people saying, no, that looks like HIMARS, no, that looks like this. But pretty sure at least one of those will have been JDAM. They can hit targets up to 45 miles away. Remember, these are kits that are added to dumb munitions that allow them to glide and give them some guidance so they get a greater range. Pretty big bomb, fairly decent range, and a much greater degree of accuracy. So we use JDAM bombs, Yuri Ignat, spokesman for the Air Force Command of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, has said. These are Western-style bombs with which our Air Force successfully strikes important targets. These bombs are slightly less powerful, but extremely accurate. It depends what you mean, less powerful. I think they are more powerful, but it depends what you're comparing them against, right? So, and they can go up to 2,000-pound bombs with the JDAM kits, I believe. I don't know what size bombs that they are receiving, whether they're like 500. In fact, it goes on to talk about them in a little bit. These bombs are slightly less powerful, but extremely accurate. I'd like to have more such bombs for the success of the front, he added. And of course, well, here it goes on to say the meaning behind the JDAMs being slightly less powerful is unclear. However, it may suggest that the weapons supplied to Ukraine are based on our £1,000 or even £500 bomb bodies rather than larger £2,000 ones. So, yeah, just thought I'd share that with you. Right, Japanese Ministry of Economy and Industry has banned the export of unmanned aircraft and space vehicles, aviation and ship engines, steel, aluminium and their products, construction, optical and photo equipment, electrical equipment, optical fiber, toys, and others to Russia. So this is going to be hugely important for the construction of manufacture of any obviously military grade equipment that requires that kind of stuff. Japan, I don't know how prevalent they are in terms of export to Russia of this sort of equipment or material, but China are going to be the ones providing Russia with most of that stuff, but still really good news. Now, I showed you indeed the tweet here. It's been deleted. I showed you a tweet yesterday, a bit of video footage of what I thought might have been Ukrainian vehicles in a tunnel, and talked about how you might hide the material for the upcoming counteroffensive. Turns out that tunnel, and this is this is another correction. Goodness me, there's a few of these the last few days. I do apologise, but it's important to call them out. Those vehicles in the tunnel were the Malaysian army in a tunnel somewhere in Malaysia, so it's not Ukrainian. I apologise, but there you go. There's a correction. That's not to say that the Ukrainians won't be hiding vehicles in tunnels in Ukraine. I would have thought that would be a super clever place to keep a load of material so it can't be hit. Right, going on to odds and sods. Now, having just criticised myself, I'm going to pat myself on the back. This is what I've said, but it's pretty obvious to me. It is extremely obvious. But this is what I've been saying for months. That and now the French presidential source, according to CNN, is saying this, which is that China is the only game changer in Russia's war in Ukraine. China may be one of the few countries that could have a game-changer effect on Russia's war for both sides, CNN reported, citing an unnamed source in France's presidential administration. You don't need to be unnamed. It's pretty obvious. If some random dude can say it on the internet, then pretty much it's open season for this kind of obvious claim. China are the only game changer. Russia are screwed as far as being able to make stuff. I just talked about that. Being able to make stuff, being able to bring new equipment to the front line. The West and the allies of Ukraine are consistently providing material for Ukraine to get some kind of asymmetrical advantage over Russia. They are constantly having their forces upgraded in terms of material, where Russia are constantly being degraded. And the only thing that can change that, Russia are unable to make new modern equipment. The only way they can change that if there's another significant country comes in to balance what Ukraine's allies are providing to Ukraine. And China is the only option there. Is the only potential nation that could do that. So yes, they are the only game changer. True. Now, the executive director of Europol has identified 150 war crimes suspects. Investigators have been analysing photos and videos from potential crime scenes since Russia launched its full-scale war on Ukraine. That's very important. And I don't know whether Russians will be worried about this, but there will be people whose names will be out there now as being perpetrators of war crimes. You are, if you ever set foot out of Russia, you'll be going to The Hague. Now, schools in Russia are introducing ever more military training programs for ever younger school-age groups, including kindergartners. I showed you some really disturbing footage. I think it's disturbing, of kids in races to clean and take apart AK-47s in class. You're like, that is not what kids should be going to school to learn. It's just that kind of stuff really disturbs me. Anyway, this is a far more widespread phenomenon. That was in Crimea, but actually, right across the Russian nation, it appears that they're militarizing their education to a much greater degree. Now, Wagner and Yevgeny Prigozhin has announced that 5,000 Wagner have been released or are due to be released. It appears that they are finishing their contracts and being allowed to go free. And indeed, a convicted murderer recruited by Wagner PMC has returned to Russia, caused people in the local community to be really scared, and has ended up now killing an old aged pensioner in the next village. So this story, I wonder if this will be repeated a number of times. There's been some growing concerns in Russia of these. Basically, imagine you living in a community where a convict that has caused all sorts of upset previously, has gone to prison for like 30 years. We're never going to see him again. Then gets let out to do some fighting for Wagner with a promise of being able to be free in 6 months' time. Then that comes to an end. He's still alive, comes back to the village. Oh, right. Yeah. You murdered my parents. Brilliant. Oh, great to see you back. That kind of thing. I wonder how widespread that will be, how problematic that will be, and whether this then sows seeds of discontent with members of the population, general population, that add to pressure on the Kremlin concerning the war. Right, going on to geopolitics. It's April the 1st. This is not an April Fool's. But it does take absurdity to a new level as Russia takes charge of the UN Security Council. Now, in Ukraine, Moscow is pursuing an unprovoked war of aggression. In The Hague, Vladimir Putin is facing an arrest warrant for war crimes. But at the UN, Russia is about to take charge of a powerful international body, the Security Council. From Saturday, that's today, it will be Russia's turn to take up the monthly. Now, the good thing is this is only for a month. Monthly presidency of the 15-member council in line with the rotation that has been unaffected by the Ukraine war. The last time Russia held the gavel was in February last year. The irony of being the month they invade. When Putin declared his, quote, special military operation in the middle of the council session on Ukraine. 14 months on, tens of thousands of people have been killed, many of them civilians. Cities have been ruined, and Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for the mass abduction of Ukrainian children. In such circumstances, putting Russia in the driving seat of a world body tasked with, quote, maintaining international peace and security seems like a cruel April Fool's joke to many, not least the Ukrainian mission to the UN. Quote, as of the 1st of April, they are taking the level of absurdity to a new level, says Sergei Kislitsa, the Ukrainian permanent representative. The Security Council, as it is designed, is immobilized and incapable to address the issues of their primary responsibility, that is prevention of conflicts and then dealing with conflicts. Yeah, it's an absolute travesty. Right, now going back to the American journalist for the Wall Street Journal, Ivan Gershkovich, who has been arrested by the FSB for supposedly spying. I've done a segment on this in the extra. I don't know if that's a second extra I did yesterday that I haven't released yet. So actually my discussion of this might come out later. But Joe Biden has called on Russia to release Gershkovich. Let him go, said Biden when asked about the case on Friday. Previously, the White House press secretary described the espionage charges leveled against Gershkovich as ridiculous. Now, it will be interesting to see what is more formally said by the White House over the coming days. It's really important that they go hard on this. However, as I talk about in my extra piece, Russia can do stuff like this and get away with it because everyone's still afraid to escalate. But perhaps this is the time where you say, right, you arrest our guys spuriously. We're going to provide long-range missiles. You want to play hard, we'll play hard. So there are lots of ways that this could go. I'd be interesting to see something more formal coming out of the White House in the coming days. Right, I've talked about that already. The largest Russian automobile manufacturer halted its production due to the lack of imported detail. So that's going to be lack of stuff. Sorry, I can't think of the word. MS brain, it's too early. But here we have, the Russian Automobile Association really suffering. As we know already, they have suffered, as well as the aviation industry. These kind of manufacturing industries, they really rely on the retail market. So air flights from and to and from Russia, or the buying and selling of, or the buying of cars, new cars in Russia. Now, with the economy slowing down, people not having money and being unable to get parts, you're going to have both a lack of retail activity and a lack of ability to actually make the damn things in the first place. So this has really hit particularly the automobile industry, and their largest manufacturer has halted production. That's obviously massive, and that's going to affect jobs. And then this is about affecting people's lifestyles and their prospects, their prosperity. And if that is hugely affected across Russia, then you'll start getting dissent for the war, I would imagine. So that kind of thing is good news for the pro-Ukrainian position. Talking about last bit on geopolitics, Maya Sandu, who is the beleaguered president of Moldova due to Russian provoked activities going on in Moldova, but she's visiting Ukraine today at Zelensky's invitation, and they discuss topical issues of bilateral cooperation. I think it's going to be really important, regionally important. If Ukraine can support Moldova and Moldova Ukraine, then that's going to put Transnistria into a pretty dodgy position as far as being a kind of another annexed state or another annexed, or not state, annexed region. Moldova is a weak nation economically speaking and politically speaking, and so it needs a lot of support. And I think the EU can support Moldova possibly through Ukraine or also directly. It's not part of the EU, but you get my meaning there. Moldova has candidate status for the EU, but you would want. Unfortunately, countries like this become pawns in the game of chess, the geopolitical chess. So, if the EU doesn't support Moldova, Russia will. So it's an important country for this geopolitical game that's being played, and Russia will be severely wanting to get influence within Moldova, and has been in fact fomenting dissent and discontent there itself. On the same kind of, well, not other European leaders are in Kiev, or were in Kiev yesterday. Prime Ministers of Slovakia, Slovenia, and Croatia arrived in Kiev to take part in a summit dedicated to the anniversary of the de-occupation of Bucha, the massacre and the war crimes in Bucha. The Minister of Defense of Slovakia is also present. So that's a lot of local leaders showing their support. There is this very strong European reaction. Yes, we can talk about Austria and Hungary as being problems there, but generally there's a unity in Europe that has taken place that Putin would desperately not have wanted to happen. This whole war has backfired on him in ways that he just simply didn't anticipate. I'm fairly sure if he knew where we would be now, just over a year later, he never would have gone into this war. History will see this as one of the worst decisions in the 21st century. Yeah. Anyway, that's all for the news. Sorry, it's another long one. Please like, subscribe, and share. I really appreciate all your support. All the ways you can support the channel are in the description below, but only do that if you have the wherewithal and desire to do so, obviously. Otherwise, you really appreciate having you here and watching and commenting as brilliantly as you do.